Okay, and welcome back to another episode of Mapping the Shadow. Today's episode is all about empathy, the essence of empathy. So why did I want to talk about empathy today? A number of reasons. The first is that, well, it's the most important quality there is when it comes to the development of self-knowledge, for reasons we're going to see. The second is that it's a grossly misunderstood quality of mind. When we often talk about empathy, given our current materialist cultural context, we often get it wrong. It's not widely understood. We know there's something there. We understand there's this kind of experiencing what others experience or feeling what others feel. And that's, yes, one way in which this shows up, this quality of empathy. But you can see it quickly falls off the rails when we start talking about other kinds of empathy. Now in the literature, they talk about cognitive empathy as an example, which when you look under the hood actually has nothing to do with the other kind of so-called empathy of feeling what others feel. Now, these terms can be useful in terms of labeling what we see and therefore come to understand it kind of mechanically, but it doesn't take us far enough in the development of true self-understanding to the extent that needs to happen right now. So that's why I've done quite a bit of work looking at the deeper essence of empathy, coming up with another way of understanding it based on psychological and spiritual principles. And that's what today's episode is largely about. But from a high level, because this is, of course, all about the dialectics of shadow and the shadow map model, empathy is very relevant to this because, as I said, it is the quality that allows this whole movement to occur in a way that moves towards a greater realization of self, a greater knowledge of self. So we can use this understanding of the model to understand empathy. And likewise, we can use empathy as a concept to make sense of what does move this process through and what perverts this process. So let's cut straight to it. I want to first go to a quote from Jung, which I've talked about many times on this show and podcast. He famously said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. So he's basically describing what empathy is here. Empathy is the willingness to meet and be transformed consciously by experience. So it's happening whether we're aware of it or not. But this willingness to actually meet with what we're experiencing and be transformed by it, whether it's another person, whether it's an experience, whether it's a thought about ourselves, this is the resource, this is the quality that produces this process, that allows the shadow to be integrated, allows the persona to be transformed into full self-recognition, not just a mere image, let alone a caricature of what we think we is, but actually what we are in our full undivided essence and self. What Hegel would have described as being both in and for itself, being both particular and whole together. You cannot merely be one without the other. They imply each other. And so this famous quote by Jung is really alluding to this whole process. And a key point that he's making here is that a reaction is occurring, actually. It's occurring whether we're aware of it or not. Therefore, for someone who does not have empathy or is not cultivating or practicing, for want of a better word, empathy, then they're still being affected and transformed, but it's happening on an unconscious level. And so this applies to all forms of personality disorder. And what's happening here is just mere adaptation to what they perceive as other and threatening to the pre-existing self-image. So that's why this quality of empathy, it's fundamental to this whole process. It is the thing, it is the difference between progress and regression. But that's not to say either that a lack of empathy doesn't make sense or shouldn't exist. We're going to be talking about this in subsequent episodes here. Everything has its place. And if anything, empathy understands that. It is the alignment. It is the understanding that there's nothing that ought to not exist here. Like everything not only exists because of something or in relation to something, but it also has a kind of purpose or teleology. There's also a forward-looking reason for it. And the moment we start casting anything out as not making sense or not being part of the desirable or natural structure of our mind or the world, we are creating a polarity. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that per se, right? This is all about polarity, duality, and wholeness, and the movement between the two. So, as I've explained, the way I think about empathy from a psychospiritual perspective is it is precisely this willingness to meet and be consciously transformed by experience. Therefore, it leaves nothing out. Doesn't mean it necessarily enjoys everything. Doesn't mean that you need to reframe everything you experience. No, there's always going to be pain and struggle and negativity and darkness. This is, of course, all about shadow work. So it's all about embracing that side of things. But moreover, it's about recognizing the fundamental irony that exists at the heart of existence. Irony is not merely a feature of our world and our experience. It's arguably the primary feature of it. Everything is compensatory. And if you can sort of train yourself to look for that, it can be very, very powerful. And of course, the greatest irony of all is perhaps that so few people seem to realize that irony is a thing, or that it's such an important part of our reality. So that is the case in point. But there are, of course, varying degrees of irony, and there are some very, very extreme forms of irony that pervade our world, and not least the very practice and structure and formula of spirituality itself. I said a few episodes ago that acting spiritual is a complete contradiction in terms. There is no acting in genuine self-knowledge. And likewise, the way in which shadow work is seemingly often practiced, at least overtly, at least in the way that it's displayed publicly in many places, is entirely ironic. It talks about projection, but fails to realize that it itself is projecting projection everywhere, and all manner of things. So for the next 2 or 3 episodes here, I'm going to be touching on this again and again, and talking about other ways of understanding these various concepts. One of which, of course, is empathy. It's the primary one. And one of the key themes here is like, understand what empathy is and train yourself to recognize it if you haven't already. Understanding empathy is not only of utmost importance for beginning any meaningful shadow work, but for continuing meaningful shadow work. Because shadow work, individuation, the whole process becomes a lot more subtle as time goes on, as progress goes on. It calls you to see the difference between ever finer nuance and understand what the real path forward is in face of all signs to the contrary. Like often the real way forward hangs out in the most unsuspecting places, the most ironic places. And as I've been alluding to throughout this entire series, the things that you probably regard to be the most important, wholesome, unquestionable values. Okay, like kindness, yeah, that doesn't take too much mental effort to understand how that can be a problem. But how can we get even more subtle than that? Like the very pursuit of shadow work itself, and what your coach or therapist might be guiding you to do, with all good intentions perhaps, but this might be counterintuitively your own mind showing you or trying to tell you exactly what not to do, or exactly in what direction to look. For example, another one is anger, even violence, right? It's these things that, certainly physical violence is the vast majority of the time not a good thing and not a helpful thing. And by that, I mean it's often the product of something not being integrated. But anything taken to its extreme becomes outmoded, becomes its opposite, in fact. And so if we hang out with any idea absolutely, for example, like if we were to identify as a pacifist, sooner or later, the world will find a way to call that belief into question. So all rules break down at their extremes. And so the idea is not to become physically violent, for example, or even to get angry in a verbal way or anything like that. The point is that if we believe that those things have no place in reality, then reality must find a way to show us to what extent that is true and untrue. And so when everyone around you is compelling you to behave a certain way, and it's resonating with a large part of yourself that also believes that to be completely true. Like, how can you have a society where people are going around just acting like vigilantes or telling people what they think to their face all the time, right? I mean, it's you see how that might fall apart. But on the contrary, how can you have a society where that doesn't happen from time to time? So again, I'm not saying there's any hard and fast rules as to how one should ever behave in any situation. There has to be a place for everything. And where we disagree with that notion, or where we absolutely believe one way or another, there's going to be some kind of challenge at some point to show us the falsity in what we've grasped as true. So there may well be situations where you have to embrace all those aspects of you, where you do have to get angry, you do have to get violent, not necessarily, but the notion that you might have to be that way has to be something that you have to embrace. And a lot of conventional shadow work, let alone spiritual teachings, are not willing to go there, because pretty much anything that you find displeasurable in the world is pretty much just judged to be your own projection by and large. But going back again to more like codes of conduct or religion in the way it's commonly practiced in a sort of exoteric, organized way, it's a lot more absolute. We talked about that in the previous episode as well, or a couple of episodes ago. This absolutism that some rules may be better than no rules, but beyond a point, they too must break down. So then, empathy, the willingness to actually meet and be transformed by experience. So of course, the opposite of that is an unwillingness to meet and be transformed. We're going to be talking about that and how that shows up. But just very briefly now, I'm showing an image of the shadow map model, where of course you have the self, and you have this implicit wholeness. But then you also have the particulars that must come out of that in order to know themselves and to know the self. For the self to become self-realized, it must divide, because it must be knowing and known. So there's a duality there. And so these particulars, whatever it is, whether it's a person, an entity, an idea, a belief, an idea about ourselves, a movement, these must be separate, and they must be able to come up against the wider reality. They must be able to meet and transform with truth, with experience. But at the same time, there has to be a degree of resistance to that, because every notion must be allowed to come to its full development. So there's naturally a bit of resistance to this as well, and that actually also serves the self. So there has to be both a willingness to transform, but also not necessarily an unwillingness, but an understanding that there has to be a separation, that separation is not a bad thing. Again, if it was, it just opens up several more questions, like, well, why is there even a thing, a separation, or why does that even happen? So empathy is what allows that to happen. But where there is no empathy, or very little empathy, it essentially says, no, I want to become whole right now, and I want to bear no credence to anything else or anyone else. And therefore, whatever we identify with, perhaps it's our perhaps it's our persona, whatever that might be, whether you want to see yourself as the world's greatest mother or father, or the best in the world at what you do professionally, well, a lack of empathy would basically mean you double down on that idea of yourself ad infinitum. Like, that is what it is. That's the end of the story. And anything other than that is just too unbearable to even consider. And so what happens is there's just so much unresolved feeling, there's so much energy that has to be experienced or reconciled in the conscious mind, that usually with a great amount of free will, one decides, that's just too much to bother with. The greatest strategy I have to feeling good right now, or to feeling calm or peaceful or lacking any tension, is I just have to decide that, well, the easiest thing is just not to go there. Just don't face the energetic tension. And you can understand why that might be kind of convincing, because, well, it does appear to work right now. Like, if there's no pain, what's the problem? But of course, this is a confusion for means with ends again. This is a misunderstanding of the holistic nature of our world, because the tension is not the problem, right? The tension is an experience, and it's indicative of a conflict. The real problem is the conflict. It's the thing that cannot be reconciled with itself. It's a self-contradiction. Because as we've discussed, right, if you take any idea to its extreme, let's say you see yourself as the world's greatest mother. But if you double down on the idea of the mother, right, it's an image first and foremost. It's not a notion. Well, it represents a notion, but the idea of mother is an image, is an idea. And it can become more nuanced as it develops. But ultimately, the for itself idea versus the in itself idea, the true essence of mother, is not the same as the idea or the image of mother. And because every mother in this world is partial, they can never hope to be the notion of mother or the mother archetype. It's just impossible. But in understanding that, one can actually be, to all intents, a kind of perfect mother. Not in the literal sense, because like perfection means flawlessness, right? But you see, in a way, that perfection actually contains imperfection. Pure perfection doesn't actually exist. It has to account for imperfection and partiality. But a lack of empathy cuts that whole understanding short and cuts the whole process of development short. Just says, no, I'm the greatest mother in the world. That's what I have to be in order to feel content, in order to avoid any tension. So it insists on having the end point now and refuses to do any actual work to realize that. And so the idea and the notion just become ever more separate, ever more ironic, and ever more self-contradictory. Or that the idea becomes more self-contradictory because it fails to continue to meet the difference. And that gap between the two is precisely what Hegel meant by the term negation. It's the kind of gradient between the actualized form as experienced and the deeper truth. And they become wider and wider. And at some point, the gap just cannot be denied. But beyond a certain point, even when it is completely undeniable that there is a difference, the truly unempathic individual is still going to deny that difference. So I don't want to go too deep into that now because we'll be talking about that later, but that's it in a nutshell. So I'm going to talk very briefly about something Jung said in his earliest days of his career in the transcendent function. For those watching on video, there's a screenshot of the key section I'm going to talk about, but I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's kind of long. I'm just going to fast forward to a summary, which is really Jung talking about 4 reasons why there is an interplay between the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the unknown. And of course, this is what empathy is and what it does. It opens up a connection to the unknown and bravely embraces that, is willing to hold that tension and walk that line and allow the two to interact. But let's just touch on briefly about why there is even a gap at all. And so he gives 4 reasons, and it's going to be very useful as we move forward over the next few episodes. So firstly, what we experience consciously is subject to a threshold intensity. So the material that we actually experience, bear in mind, it's just what's there explicitly as opposed to implicitly in the unconscious. And a lot of that has to do with how much energy that particular content has. So it's like if you have a certain experience during the day, maybe you're running after a train and you just catch the train, something really banal like this. Well, maybe you have a dream that night about struggling to catch a train on time. It doesn't necessarily mean that your dream is about missing a train per se, or just your mind going over again what it experienced in the day. It usually has a much deeper symbolic significance. So the train might well represent something like the will and the ability that you have to apply energy to make things happen or to pursue your own self-knowledge. And your difficulty catching it might well have some other relationship to things that are going on in your life. So whatever it means in this individual situation is likely going to need a lot deeper discussion because it's never as logical as it purports to be, or as it might seem to be to the conscious mind. But the point is there that this threshold intensity depends on what is close to mind. And secondly, there is what Freud talked about as censorship or inhibition, or what I've termed here ignorance of those things which are deemed incompatible, yes, but it's also that the mind can only really render things in terms of what it knows. In fact, that's a principle that pretty much applies to all 4 of these points here. Like, how can it possibly see things as they are? Because there's a relationship going on between the conscious and the unconscious. When you look out at the world, when I look at this plant in front of me or the microphone in front of me, naturally I can only see it in terms of something. It's not that I'm just seeing something necessarily as it is, but that I am meeting with the object. This is fundamental to Jungian psychology, to all forms of psychology, to the philosophy on which it came from, not least idealist philosophy. It's fundamental to Kant. It was what Kant was all about, really. So this is a key philosophical underpinning to everything that's currently going on in our world and in philosophy. And it's a key lesson to what we'd all do well to understand in today's world. It wasn't like the main lesson that we had to learn 400 years ago, but now it's pretty important. Plug that in. So the third point here is present moment adaptation. So in other words, the conscious mind is just focusing on the immediate challenges of what's happening right now versus its forgotten past and inherited structures. And by the way, these 4 points that Jung has laid out, you see, I always like to try and chalk these up to a more fundamental principle. And that's basically why I have the shadow map. That's one way of thinking about it and why this happens. Ultimately, it's energetic. It's just the meeting of consciousness with the unconscious. And that produces all of these effects here. Present moment adaptation, and lastly, latent material. So where there's unresolved tension, there has to be a way for that to come to the surface. And Jung commented that this readily explains the complementary attitude of the unconscious to the conscious. And this is precisely why empathy as a quality is so important, because it is that way in which the two are able to meet and transform each other. So if you're familiar with my 7 habits model, then you'll be aware that habits 1 and 2 relate to empathy, and they form that first cornerstone, which is about understanding or empathy. And so just breaking that down then, each habit splits off into 3 facets. And so this first habit, habit 1, which I call take responsibility for your mind, this comprises a lot more than what it sounds like on the surface. The first point is to simply understand the unconscious to a practical degree, understand how it works, understand its relationship to conscious mind, understand the forces of eros and thanatos, that's facets 2 and 3. And moving into the second habit, that's cultivate wholesome intentions. As I said a couple of episodes ago, again, this is not about just adhering to an idea of good intentions. Even the word wholesome has sort of come to be associated with good. But that's not what this means here, because what it's really referring to is intentions that lead back towards wholeness, or at least allow the process to unfold, that don't get stuck in a dissonance loop of insisting upon the self or the idea of self to the nth degree. And so that habit breaks down into intention to look into the self, which prevents inflation, prevents the confusion of the self-image for the wider truth. The intention to let go, which tempers the eros movement, the need to go out and make something your own, to become identified with something, or to bring something into the self. And thirdly, the intention to love, which tempers the thanatos aspect. So again, there's nothing wrong with either aspect of those. There's nothing wrong with going towards something. There's nothing wrong with pushing away. There's nothing wrong with self-expression in its essential form. There's nothing wrong with self-sacrifice to an extent either. But it's you take either of those to its extreme and it becomes self-contradictory and dissonant. And so this third piece tempers thanatos, doesn't remove it, doesn't ignore it, doesn't negate it, doesn't pretend that it's not part of reality, or it doesn't serve some kind of purpose. But it tempers it so that it doesn't go off on its own and become insistent upon itself at the expense of everything else. So this is my attempt really to break down what empathy actually consists of by way of things you can do to understand it better and to cultivate it. But ultimately, it's a quality of mind that you already understand on some level. Forget about definitions on YouTube or wherever you find them about feeling what others feel and so on. That has a very limited practical use in shadow work. And furthermore, it's very easy to fake that. One thing you can never fake is the ability to, or the willingness to transform, meaningfully transform. You might be able to fake adaptation. You might be able to feign transformation. You might be able to say all the right things. But ultimately, meaningful empathy cannot be faked. It is the one thing that cannot be faked. Once you know what you're looking for, once you really understand it, you'll never be duped or fooled by a lack of empathy. Again, here on the image, I've got a picture of a chameleon in a suit. So clearly, it's one thing to act like you're empathic and compassionate. Anyone could say the right things in a therapy session or feign compassion. And I think what people usually think of as empathy actually looks more like compassion. And they pretty much use the two terms interchangeably. They're not the same thing. I mean, empathy can show up in that way, but it's not the same thing, because empathy is a willingness to transform. And that is something that is really important to understand. So, that said, I'm going to thank you for your time and attention. Hope you found this discussion on empathy useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.